right, hi everyone. Hopefully those who are on the phone are back from wherever they went to. We're reconvening here. And this is Nancy Fresco jumping in to give the very brief, again, sort of high elevation overview on the climate results. And actually this is divided into climate results, which I'm starting with, and then the linked portions, which are fire and permafrost, which are modeled separately, but of course are linked to climate. So keep in mind as I go through this that what I'm trying to pull out here are just some of the key points, some of the take-home messages. And it's actually going to be this afternoon when I do a bit more of an in-depth presentation on each of these, the climate, the fire, and the permafrost modeling and results. That isn't to say you shouldn't ask questions during this portion, but you can also kind of contemplate and maybe hold some of those questions for when I get into the details later on. But this is the big picture to kind of help inform what you're going to hear from some of the other folks who get to talk about how climate cross-tabs with conservation elements and other portions of the analysis. So starting with the slide that you can see in front of you, again, sort of main take-home messages from our climate modeling. I'm not going to talk too much about the background of that modeling. I think most of you are already familiar at this point from all our previous meetings that these are models that came from the Scenarios Network for Alaska and Arctic planning, and then were selected and fine-tuned and clipped down and analyzed on the basis of the parameters for this REA. So this particular table that you're looking at is one that I pulled out just because it's readable and it gives you a sense of the kind of products that we created here. This particular one happens to be for mean January temperature. We created outputs for January as the coldest month, July as the hottest month, as well as for shoulder season conditions represented by data thaw and data freeze. But the big picture, the take home on climate is that significant warming is expected long term. And there's a very, very clear trend. That trend is quite slight in the near term, and I would say that that's mostly because we're really only looking 1 decade out at this point. We averaged our climate data across decades in order to really show trend rather than all the stochastic ups and downs that make up weather rather than climate, and that degree of, you can call it uncertainty, you can call it natural variability, is built into all of the climate models that we're using, the climate models that are downscaled. So in order to show trend more clearly, we're averaging across decades. And that means that in comparing current, we're looking at the 2010s. In looking at near term, meaning 2025, we're looking at the 2020s. So there's just a 1 decade shift there. So you're seeing, in this particular example, January temperatures, some fairly subtle warming for the near term and some much more marked warming for the far term. I should point out that those are all degrees Celsius. So, of course, those are larger degrees in Fahrenheit degrees. So that's really quite a bit of warming going on. And in this case, these particular results are broken down not at the level of map pixels, because obviously you couldn't put that in the table, and not at the level of the fifth level HUCs, which are reporting units, and all of this data is all served out at the finest scale at 771 meter resolution and at the fifth level HUCs. But these are actually third level HUCs, which were convenient for reporting purposes, gives you an idea of the regional portions of the REA. So significant warming is expected. Hydrologic change is more likely to be driven by permafrost thaw than by precipitation change. So we have lots of results on what's happening with precipitation, and there are changes taking place. But the take-home from this is that we're quite likely to see some really significant hydrologic change across the REA, but it's going to be more driven by that below-ground thaw, most likely, than by changes in precipitation. And then finally, links between climate and vegetation are complex, but do suggest some shifts in biome. And I'm going to be talking quite a bit more about that. It can be pretty hard to wrap your head around because we have separate models that don't take exactly the same inputs, and it's a little tricky to explain, but we are expecting assemblages over time.
And these are all air temperature changes, right? We don't have water temperature.
Yes, and I will talk about that in a moment with, when I talk about data gaps. These are air temperature changes. And why will my slide not advance?
That's from the arrow down the bottom.
Now you can do it.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Okay, so segueing straight into the data gaps, psychically. So these are the major data gaps, and we tried to separate out data gaps from limitations. So limitations just refer to, how much information you can get from a model. Data gaps are pieces of information that just are missing, either, mostly because that those data have not been collected, and often they represent sort of a wish list of things that we really would love to see added. So water temperature is one of those. There are, of course, data on water temperature from around the state, but they are not long-term enough. They're not gridded. They're not continuous enough to come up with meaningful projections about how water temperature links to climate change. So, we have these clear projections of warming air temperature. Logically speaking, water would get warmer as well, but it's not a one-to-one representation, and we don't have the algorithms for that. We also, for this project, had no daily climate data. That is actually, for those who are involved in future REAs, we at SNAP are working on getting high-quality daily projections, which will be a great addition. But what we have here are based on monthly data. Without the daily data, you can't so easily predict the extreme events, the things that are tied to, like, the highest rainfall, the hottest temperature. But we did, as you'll hear when I get more in depth, we did find ways of getting around that, ways of trying to approximate some of those issues. But it's a data gap. And then precipitation data do not differentiate between rain and snow, nor is there any direct metric for snowpack depth. And that's a tough one. Again, we found ways to get around that, but we have essentially precip data or rainwater equivalents. And then this is a data gap kind of more core and integral to all the climate models. Something to keep in mind is that long-term climate stations are extremely sparse in Alaska. So all of these models are interpolated and downscaled using real data from real climate stations. They're modeled at the global level, so global circulation models that are then downscaled. That downscaling is done with the best timescale algorithms available, and they're pretty darn good. They're pretty impressive. The gridded data sets from PRISM that take into account slope and elevation and aspect and of course the distance to the nearest known climate station data point. But there's just a limit to how many of those climate stations we have, and that makes it just a little harder to interpolate those models.
Can you remind me how many are in the YKL?
Oh gosh, it's the ones that are actually within the boundaries of the YKL.
Are there any?
I'm trying to remember because we looked at the ones that were we looked at ones that kind of were close.
Yeah.
And we weren't directly doing those interpolations. We were basing it on the statewide. I think there's one.
Maybe there's a climate
long-term climate station. I think there's only one that's actually in the boundaries. I'd have to check back on that. But yeah, it's more just a systemic problem that there aren't that many. There's not that much long-term data. And this is something that's going to be touched upon later, but by Tracy and others talking about links between climate and conservation elements. But we dug deep in the literature. We harassed people for their primary research. We dug as deep as we could, but the literature just does not always exist to provide the connection between threshold values and what happens to conservation elements. So you can say, we're pretty confident it's getting 4 degrees warmer in January, but what does 4 degrees warmer in January mean for species X? If it's not there in the literature, it's hard to make that connection. So we tried to find those connections as much as we could, but that's certainly a data gap. And then the last one I have up here is that there are time lags, obviously, between changes in climate and changes in vegetation, biome, ecosystem. It's very obvious that there are time lags, but the time lags vary species to species, biome to biome, and there's not always very clear data on how to interpret that, on how long those lags may be. So you say, okay, there's clearly going to be a pressure toward biome shifts because of radical climate change in such and such area, but how that plays out in terms of what species you see there can be pretty unclear because you don't know how that lag will play out. Okay, so again, this is the really sort of broad picture view. Moving on from climate to fire, just a really brief interpretation. I'm throwing maps at you, and I realize that's a little unfair when I'm trying to give a brief overview. But these maps represent some of our modeling outputs from the alfresco model, the Alaska Frame-Based Ecosystem Code, which, as I think you all know, is a spatial fire model, but it's not spatial in the sense of being predictive. A fire will occur in this spot in this year. Anyone who's familiar with fires in Alaska knows that's impossible to predict even right here, right now, this summer. But what it does is it provides a really, really carefully calibrated probability of burn based on flammability of each pixel, how old the vegetation is in each pixel, what the vegetation is in each pixel, and a probabilistic fire start mechanism. Great thing about the model is that it can be really well calibrated using historical data, because we actually do have pretty good historical fire data, and you can run this model because it runs on a computer. You got lots of time to do it. You can run it and spin it up for 1,000 years to try to get as close as you possibly can to the real landscape that we know we have. Because of the insistence on really, really, really ideal calibration, when we ran this for this REA, for the YKL, we couldn't meet the deadline to get the calibration for the tundra types perfect enough to meet the strict standards of the folks doing it in my office. So we output just the results for the forest, and said luckily that's 90+% of the area here, so it doesn't too much denigrate the outputs. But the take-home message here: fire return intervals are expected to shorten in forested areas. Definitely, very clear picture that fire would become more frequent. In other words, that the average age of the vegetation in forested areas would become younger. Younger vegetation in forests means a higher proportion of deciduous vegetation. Obviously, you burn black spruce and white spruce, and it at least temporarily resets to birch and aspen, and also to a loss of lichen. A lot of our forested land cover has at least some proportion of lichen in the understory, but that occurs more in the older, black spruce forests, and not so much in the young deciduous. Lichen, the literature tells us very clearly, takes a long time to come back after fire. So pretty clear take home on that. And then finally, changes are likely to level off in the long term, and that's something you can actually see in these maps. We have the 2010s, the 2020s. We threw in the 2050s because it kind of helps give you some bookends. We're actually looking at the year 2060, so the 2050s and the 2060s. Bookend that year, and in this case, having both those decades isn't as redundant as it seems, because you see a little bit of a drop going on in the fire frequency toward the end there. And that's actually what can be expected and predicted for fire modeling, in the sense that if the burns ramp up enough, eventually you kind of reach an equilibrium, because now you've got a lot of deciduous forest that doesn't burn as easily, and so the alfresco model chills out and slows down at a higher level, though. So you notice that the burn frequencies in the 2050s and the 2060s are still much higher than the modeled burn frequencies for the current decade. So that's kind of the overall picture there. Fire gas. I've already said fire can only be modeled stochastically. You really can't have a forecast of fire. It's really tough to even do that for the current year, let alone long term. But you can have a forecast of fire probability, fire danger, fire incidents across large landscapes. So that's what this is. And I already mentioned that we unfortunately had to omit tundra fire. There was a huge amount of effort that went into the calibration there. Long story short, the reason that tundra fire is more difficult to calibrate is because, I said, our calibrations are really strong because there's so much data on fire history, and so you can make things match really perfectly. There have been far, far fewer tundra fires historically. It used to be a pretty rare occurrence. Tundra fires are becoming more frequent. From the literature, we can pull out that as a take-home message, I would say. It's strong enough and clear enough. Tundra fires are increasing, but because we couldn't get enough calibration data in the time we had available, we don't have numbers to run on that. Big one there that's in bold is that no consistent data are available for fire severity, and that's unfortunate, and we'd really like to be able to pull together long-term more data on that, just because the feedbacks from a severe fire in terms of loss of lichens, regrowth after fire, just impacts on habitats and biomes are really different for a light burn, something that just passes through and leaves the trees living, compared to something that just burns through the whole dust layer. So, I think that ties into the last one there, that the feedbacks are not always clear or well understood between fire, permafrost, climate, and vegetation. We've done what we can from the literature to try and capture that, but more data in that realm would be enormously helpful. So going on to the third major category I'm flying through here, permafrost results. And again, most of you know that these results are the outputs of a joint model between SNAP, using our climate data, and then using the permafrost model from folks at the Geophysical Institute Permafrost Lab, also up at UAF. This work was done by Dr. Sergei Marchenko, and so he used all the inputs that are already in their model, which are ground truths using boreholes. Again, a bit of a data gap. It would be nice if we could have thousands rather than dozens of boreholes, but money is limited. Take home here is that dramatic thawing is projected across much of the RAA area, and this, of all the climate results, I think this is one of the biggest and most important ones, just because this area happens to be located in a zone that is shifting from mean annual temperatures being, often below freezing for much of it, to mean annual temperatures being above freezing. And what this model does is it factors in all the insulation and the lag times, what's the delay between temperatures rising above freezing, air temperatures, and the ground thawing. So it's wonderful to have this model to do that. But the message is pretty simple. If the average annual temperature stays above freezing, in a long-term trend for long enough, the ground thaws, and that has huge ramifications for hydrology, for what species can take root there, even in areas that aren't thawing at sort of our benchmark, which is 1 meter depth. The active layer is getting thicker, and that really kind of changes everything in terms of what can take root there. A few more inches of active layer, and different species are going to make themselves at home there. And the hydrologic change is likely to be of particular note in areas that are undergoing this shift from continuous to discontinuous permafrost, or from discontinuous to essentially no permafrost. So as I said before, this might be a more important story than in terms of hydrology and how much water availability there is and where the water lies in the landscape. It might be a more important story than what you see coming out of precipitation change. There are, of course, data gaps in this story. One of the biggest is that it's really tricky to figure out the feedback loops between permafrost thaw, vegetation change, and hydrology. You can say, yeah, we're expecting some pretty radical hydrologic change across a big part of this area, but a lot of that occurs at the micro level, and the literature doesn't always support, pinpointing exactly what those changes will be, particularly when there are threshold dynamics at play. And I think all of us are familiar with permafrost, where everything looks the same, and then suddenly your house falls into a pit, and that kind of thing is really tough to predict, because these changes are occurring underground, and then suddenly there's a slump, roads washed out. That road washout, people perceive as happening really, really fast. It hasn't really happened fast. a long-term trend, and that can be really, really tough to predict and tough to connect the feedback loops. And then a tough one here, it's a data gap, it's also a limitation, the question of scale. You know, we're modeling permafrost at the finest scale we've got, but it's still much too coarse to predict whether that slump is going to take place under your cabin or your neighbor's cabin. It's not a 30-meter resolution, and those data are not likely anywhere in the near future. So for managers, it means that you have to look at landscape results and then take your knowledge of what's happening at a micro level and try to apply those landscape results to it. So I will stop there.
Nancy,
Yes.
This is Cindy up in Fairbanks. Before you go on to the next topic, could you go back one slide to the maps of your permafrost? So in this instance, to make this map a little bit more easy to understand, or to make a further, maybe it wouldn't be a further interpretation from it, but or to highlight where that change between discontinuous and continuous permafrost is, would it be appropriate to, you know, create more of an ISO line along these temperature gradients that would highlight the major regions of change, or is that not appropriate?
No, we have other analyses. These permafrost results, as you'll see later on, have been, you know, combined and incorporated in several other analyses of change. So sort of pinpointing areas that are likely to undergo that shift from continuous to discontinuous. So yeah, there aren't that kind of ISO lines on here, but yes, that is part of the analysis. Saying, okay, on this map, you just have to eyeball it and say, okay, you know, look at the 2010, all that area in the far north that's solidly blue is you know, is pretty solid, stable, continuous permafrost. Across much of the middle there, it is permafrost ground, but you can see that it's very, very close to that threshold. All that sort of white is permafrost area, but it's ice on the brink, and so that's the area that by the 2060s has turned to that light salmon color. So that's an area of great change. Up in the far north in the 2060s, you still see shades of blue. Those shades of blue mean that at 1 meter depth, the temperature is still below freezing. However, those areas also are likely to undergo thawing, you know, spot thaw in warmer areas, south-facing slopes and around water bodies, and deepening active layer. And so in addition to these map outputs, we also have maps of active layer thickness, and these outputs have been combined in a lot of interesting ways with discussion of landscape integrity and with discussion of conservation elements. So I think you'll see these interpreted in ways that might be of interest to you. Were there other questions for me before I pass this on to invasive species?
All right, well, thanks. I'm Matt Carlson, and I'm talking about the invasive section here. And Jamie encouraged me for this morning portion to talk a little bit about the management implications, sort of how we can use the data that we're generating through the REA. And as a little bit of background, I mean, I think we're all familiar with what invasive species are. These are these non-native species that are liable to cause economic or environmental, ecological harm or to human health. And these are implicit in all rapid ecoregional assessments. That's a change agent. And we're familiar with things like sheep. What's that? Okay. We're all familiar with cheatgrass in the Great Basin, right? And how this has been, after it became established in the late 1800s, it changed fire frequencies where fires used to occur around every 100 years or so. After the invasion of cheatgrass, it went down to less than a decade, like every 3 years, right? And that promotes even more cheatgrass establishment and changes the whole landscape and all the species, and things are completely different, and that, of course, promotes more fire. And then there's all kinds of implications for land managers, like endangerment of things like the Gunnison sage grouse, where cheatgrass is implied there as one of the key elements to its loss of habitat and decline surrounding populations and things like that. And in the YKL REA, there's kind of three themes, I think, in which the invasive species are kind of centered around. Like, what's the current status of non-native species in the region? What do we forecast for the future, or what areas are vulnerable to invasion? And then what are these pathways or likely pathways of invasion? And I have this additional images here that encourages me to think about, I usually work in terrestrial systems, but also aquatic systems are also very susceptible to invasion, and we're seeing some of these recent invaders in the interior of Alaska, like Alodia, that appears to be changing the ecology of these freshwater systems. Okay, so a little nutshell of what we have in the YKL region. Basically, there's not very many non-native species that are recorded in the region. We don't know of any non-native animals that are present there. Probably house mice and things like that are present, but that's probably just localized in communities and things like that. There is a reasonable amount of data on non-native plant species. There's something like 600 infestations of non-native plants in this region. By and large, those are all concentrated in areas of human habitation, again, road systems and trail systems. A little bit into the floodplains between Aniak and Sleepmute. There's a number of non-native plants that have established on these floodplains. But these species that are established in floodplains tend to be ones that are not really highly invasive, things like plantain and pineapple weed, so not particularly invasive species. And so Megumi put this map here together, and this shows the locations of where these non-native plant infestations are found, as well as whether there's species that are considered to be more invasive or not, and those are shown darker red colors. Okay, so we have this kind of widespread but low density situation. And then the most problematic species, and these are just, really, I don't know, like a dozen or a couple of dozen infestations. They tend to be associated, or they all are associated with the largest population centers like McGrath and Galena, Aniak. So it includes things like white sweet clover, yellow sweet clover, pea shrub, Siberian pea shrub, and bird cherries. And these are potentially problematic species. They're located on these, towns and things like that, but they're also, all these towns are located on rivers, and things like sweet clover is a really good colonizer of floodplains along, sandbars of rivers, and so these propagules can be moving downstream and establishing on the floodplains. So one of the things that we did was we looked at what kinds of either climate or anthropogenic or environmental variables are associated with areas that have weed problems across interior Alaska, and that's what this map is showing. The areas that are modeled to have low probability of invasion are shown in the cooler colors, and the higher probabilities of having weedy messes are shown in the warmer colors. And then we've also mapped where known infestations of non-native plants occur as the black dots over this. And so I think our models match, the empirical data fairly well. There's one portion up in the northern portion that's shown as a fairly high probability of having weeds in it. That's around Huslia, and more recent data, survey data, has shown that there are non-native species there as well. And another thing that our analysis indicated is that really it's anthropogenic variables that are way more important than our climate variables in determining whether there's going to be weeds in a region or not. And most of the climate variables that were important have to do with things like the length of the growing season, how warm it is during the summer, how early the thaw dates are, and things like that. So as you can see from this map, we predict that there's pretty low vulnerability through the vast majority of this region currently. And the places that do show potential for impacts are, around these population centers like McGrath. And then projected in 2025. There's not a whole lot of change, a little bit more increase in probabilities associated along the Kuskokwim River. And then by 2060, mostly associated with the road, the Kuskokwim Road, you suggest that there is a potential for greater weed impacts along that river system there.
What Kuskokwim Road are you referring?
What's the Kuskokwim Road, Walker?
Well, there are two roads.
Right.
There's a proposed road connecting Kuskokwim and Yukon.
Okay.
These are really very preliminary proposals. We don't know if anything will ever be built at this point. There's another road that we think might eventually happen, which connects that all the way down to Bethel, along the Kuskokwim, because there's a gas line going in for Donlin that goes closer to many communities and parallels the river to a certain extent. So that would eventually lead to a road possibly along the Kuskokwim.
That's the one you're calling the Kuskokwim Road, McGrath to Bethel?
Or the Hall Road, is that the one we've been referring to as the Hall Road?
No.
Yeah.
These align with the roads to resources there?
Right. No,
I've
it's not.
never heard of it, no.
Okay.
I've never heard of this road. So these are really just potential
Yeah.
Do you have a graphic of it?
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Not in this presentation, but in the afternoon.
Okay, great.
So this is Tim in Fairbanks. I had a question on that map. Did you compare that with just boundaries of areas that have been surveyed and see whether the low probability areas just actually correlate with places no one's looked?
Right, that is a really good question, and that's a large data gap with the non-native plant data. There's something like around 20 places that we have in our database where people have looked in this region and not found weeds. So, yeah, we don't have a whole lot of those negative data points to understand if that's the case, but those do match up pretty well with these patterns that we're seeing in our models. And, part of the cautionary tale, the next portion of this that I'll talk about, and I don't know how much time I really have here, is to think, okay, well, right now it looks like we don't really have much of a problem with non-native species in this region. But also, if we think about the context in which the state is changing in terms of how many more species are becoming established and how many more cases we have where the ecology is being affected, I think that's important to keep in mind. And so this figure here is just showing that the rate of introductions of non-native species in the state is increasing. And we're gaining like 5 new non-native plants per year now, and 10, 20 years ago we were only gaining 1 or 2. And there's been additional research that's showing that there are some potential ecological impacts of things like waterweed or elodia. This is work by Amy Larson and Nick Lattuso, as well as Toby Schroer, showing that after elodia established in China's slough, there's this great increase in the amount of vegetation and a reduction in grayling habitat. And Toby has suggested that this is costing the region something like $500,000 per year in lost revenue. So, this is upstream from the region that we're talking about. And also elodia is present all throughout lakes in the Anchorage Bowl and Kenai Peninsula as well. And also, if we think about like what the situation in Alaska as a whole is like, it's very similar to a lot of western states roughly 100 years ago, right? So Montana in 1925 didn't really think it had much of a spotted knapweed problem. Spotted knapweed is really bad for foraging habitat for elk. But today, all counties in Montana have infestations of this plant. And Alaska today, only has, half a dozen or so of these spotted knapweed infestations. So we don't want to see that in the, 100 years from Alaska having all regions of the state with this species. I don't think spotted knapweed is one that we have to worry about, but certainly other species are. And just a couple more slides here. I think it's important that we keep in mind how invasions typically progress and what the costs are to land managers. And so on the x-axis here, we have time with introductions occurring here, and then as the populations expand, obviously the area invested increases, and then the associated costs with those, either controlling those infestations or the impacts associated with them increase through time as well. And then these bars are showing what sort of management strategies are most appropriate at these different stages. Obviously, prevention prior to introduction is really important. And then when you have these incipient, really small populations, which I think is the case that we have in the YKL, we have opportunities for eradication, so we don't have to get into these much more expensive forms of management, and much less successful ones like containment and then just learning to live with these non-native species. So I think we have great opportunities here as well. And then, where are some of the products I think that that are coming out of the REA are potentially useful? When we're developing these early detection and rapid response protocols for dealing with weed invasions or non-native invasions in general, after these management goals have been established, it's useful to know like what species are likely to be causing problems in those areas that are most susceptible to invasion. And I think that's kind of where the products that we're producing here are useful. And then we can start talking about control techniques, management plans, seeing how those control techniques are working, and then revising the management goals at the end. Okay. And what kind of data limitations are there? Obviously, the amount of survey effort in this region is fairly low. The BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service has done a fair amount of survey work, but it's still really localized into areas where people live, where there are road systems and river systems. I'll talk more about the vectors this afternoon, but we don't really have good data in Alaska about how invasive species are moving around, and also the probability, once they move around, the probability of them establishing. We don't really have very good data on that. And then one of the, I think, most important things is we don't have an idea for most of these species what the impact on either these conservation elements specifically or just ecology in general after they become established. And oftentimes it requires, really large populations of invasive species to have established before we even recognize what these ecological effects are. Luckily, we don't have too many of those cases. And this background here is Salmon Lake. There's a BLM campground on the Seward Peninsula, but probably the only BLM campground in North America, or that doesn't have any non-native plant species.
Really?
Yeah. Okay. So.
Do you have any take-home messages on the insect and disease also, or?
Yeah, on the insect and disease, I didn't include slides for that. I will this afternoon. But insect and disease effects are pretty widespread, especially along riparian areas in the region. They have been for a long time. And spruce beetle is the worst one affecting spruce, but there are also impacts on larch. I don't know if, Tim, you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think the current trend is that spruce beetle are historically have been located in riparian areas that currently, like within the past 5 years, are only really found in the southeastern portion around really on the non-Dalton Lake Clark. And those infestations recently have been declining in both severity and size. But there are a number of other insect pests that have not been problematic in the past, such as birch leaf roller, that are now becoming problematic.
And maybe a data gap to include there is that all the surveys are done along the major river systems, and so we don't really have an understanding of what the impacts on forests outside of those kind of larger floodplain systems. All right, I don't know if anybody has questions or if I've got time for questions.
Switch here.
Okay.
This is Karen out in Galena, and I'm just wondering how useful it would be for you guys to have more data points of places that don't have invasive plants, I mean.
Yeah, that would be really, really useful.
Yeah, you'll see in the detailed methods for the WE model and the basic models, those absence points would make a huge difference in our training and our ability to develop models that are meaningful. I mean, 20 compared to 600 positive records is a pretty low percentage of absences. And so, yeah, having those surveyed areas that we know invasives don't exist would probably bolster the climate stuff an awful lot, which would be really good.
Yeah, and what we've discovered in trying to cross any species with climate or, for modeling purposes, I'd say an overarching data gap is absence data, which sounds sort of weird. We want to know where things aren't. But for a species, it's so hard because, yeah, people will record, there's swans nesting here, but people don't really walk around saying, there aren't swans nesting here, and it makes it for really problematic modeling, so that is something that would be great to have.
I know we could drum up a lot of historic data, but it might be interesting to kind of develop a campaign. I know at least in refuges there are folks doing a lot of vegetation surveys where if we could kind of just let them know and give them a simple survey form for absence, primarily focusing a little more on absence, because I think everything we've run across previously has really pointed toward trying to identify and locate the presence of non-natives.
Yeah. It could be something where you could tap into traditional ecological knowledge if you get a bunch of people to say, no, the species has never been here, and it could be a useful data set.
Hi, so let's switch gears a little bit from invasive species to somebody who's supposed to be there. The population that lives there and the population that belongs there. I'm Day1. I'm with ICER. I'm going to focus on anthropogenic factors or human footprint and related things. It'll be really quick. Just as a refresher, we have about 20 management questions that are classified as anthropogenic factors or agents or however we want to call it, and they are pretty scattered in terms of their topic areas. We try to reorganize them into groups, but there's so much overlap. So if you feel like I'm jumping all over the place, that's where it's coming from. So please bear with me. Broadly, we have 33 communities, most of them small, just over 5,000 people living in this large area. So when we talk about community footprints, we have about 25,000 square miles, I think, square kilometers, that says it's community footprints, but really it's not that much. We don't know where the data is coming from. I'm talking about the data as we have it, and I'm also referring to the limitations. The Census Bureau releases title files, and that's where we got the footprint areas from, but the footprint areas, there is no way to tell where they got it from. Sometimes it feels like they got them from the native select lands that are part of the land status map, but we know that some of the tribes did not select their lands yet. So, and sometimes they don't match the actual selection. So we don't really know where the Census Bureau got their areas from, but that's what it adds up to. If we add up, that's the area that the community footprints occupy. And in general, that's just the socioeconomic conditions of the population here. The population is declining. There's high unemployment rate, about 35% unemployment rate across the last 10 years. Schools are closing. In the last 3 years, I think 3 schools closed. And data that's available to assess the socioeconomic conditions and make meaningful projections for the future is minimal. And there are multiple problems with that. I'll get into it a little bit later. Generally, the cost of living is on the rise. There are very few options as far as housing or transportation. There's very high dependence on diesel oil and fuel oils in general, and the cost of living directly correlates with the cost of the fuel, because everything that they do depends on, they depend on fuel, either subsistence or travel or eating and anything that they have to do to live there. So it's very connected, and this graph shows you the projected diesel fuel price in $2012 to 2035. This is coming from the energy, the diesel fuel projections done for the Alaska Energy Authority. This is a general land status map. I'm quickly sharing a few results, which will go into more detail this afternoon. This is a land status map that Jamie was showing earlier. Here we have areas in square kilometers for each of them, and sometimes it is not ownership, it's just management regulatory authority that these agencies have. Sometimes it's ownership, and it gets a little tricky to really get our heads around when it comes to state patent or TA and state select. We'll get into more detail this afternoon about it, what the difference is, and how much can we differentiate between these three categories, between state patent, TA, and select. Similarly, between native patent, IC, and native select. And it makes a difference what you can do on those lands, depending on what status they fall into.
Just a quick question.
Sure.
The colors of the land status,
The colors.
don't seem to be consistent with previous maps that we've seen, and are they consistent throughout the plan, or could they be?
Of what we did with the colors here, they may be appearing differently on the screen, but we followed the color scheme suggested by the metadata.
Okay. It seems
This is Cindy up in Fairbanks. If I could just chime in, this land status layer that DeWalker has up right now is the color scheme that BLM uses as its standard, and I don't think this was the color scheme that Jamie had on a previous slide. If you're talking about which one to use, please use this one.
Yeah, we kind of muted it, I think.
Yeah, we washed it out, so we'll make sure that it appears the same, yeah. We are using the same layer file, but yeah, if we transparency or anything, it mutes it out, so.
Okay, muted it, I think that's fine line, just cut this all. But that's a good point, because we ourselves got confused at the beginning of this project, what these colors mean, and it took us a while to really understand all these different categories, because metadata doesn't really explain the definitions of these different categories.
Well, since we're talking about this map, I don't think the acres in the table are actually correct. I mean, the square kilometers.
Square kilometers, they're not correct?
Yeah, I don't think so, because I don't think the military has 116,000 square kilometers.
That surprised me too, because I couldn't find those colors.
Yeah.
But that's what comes up in calculations in GIS, but,
Yeah, but
I'll
those are
double check.
different,
I'll double
really
check.
different numbers.
Yeah, we need to double check.
Yeah, and I don't think the native select is that big either. There's not that much left still to be over selection. But they're not that over selected, is what I'm saying. The state is very over selected, but the native corporations are not that over selected.
That
So anyway,
yeah.
we
We'll
don't
go
need to
into
sell
more
it from
details
now,
this
but I just
afternoon,
think we
because
need to relook at that table. Yeah. I don't think the numbers.
I was really surprised with the state select lands, how much that comprises of the entire state select lands for the entire state. It's 52% in YKL.
Yeah, and I don't
I was shocked
actually
when I
think
saw
that's
that.
the case either, because the dark blue is way more than the light blue on that map. So anyway, I
Right,
think that
so,
table just
yeah.
needs to be relooked at.
We'll
Across
double
the
check
board.
on that.
Yeah.
This is just an example of human footprint mining, because I selected this slide to show now because many people were interested in mining, and the data on mining. What we're showing here is all the placer mines and hard rock mines that are obtained from ARDF file that USGS maintains. I picked this for various reasons. One of the big reasons is, as much data there is in this file, it comes with a lot of different limitations. And one of the big limitations that it comes with is the date of reported activity, the last reported activity. From our conversations with I think his last name is Wilson, here at USGS. It seemed like there was no systematic process of how this is done. It's more of, it felt like it's more of a voluntary thing that USGS does for the good of humankind, or something like that. So it hasn't been updated for the last year, and it's hard to tell what the current status is of any of these mines. Given all that, it's still useful to have, and these are the numbers, active and inactive and undetermined. We don't know what undetermined means. There's not much of an explanation in the data set, but this is the best we got.
I think you might be able to get better data than that from the state DNR and from BLM on what mines are actually active, and also the actual mining claim layers would give a better idea of where mines could potentially develop, even if there's not an active mine on them right now.
Yeah, we have mining claims data layer, which we'll discuss this afternoon. I actually personally went to DNR's office, and they promised me a file of all the mine sites, and I very enthusiastically got it and opened it on my computer, and it's exactly the same file, the ARDF file from USGS. So there, actually, that's not the only source that I got the same file from. There were multiple sources that used the same data, which goes to show the importance of this data set, because this seems to be the most comprehensive data set we have.
Just to note, we have scabs of data that we don't actually reduce to a data layer. So it's quite possible that that there's information about whether or not these are active or inactive that exists that's not like GIS ready. You know, but that they have to have a permit, for example, and they have to have a claim, and all of these things have to kind of happen. So and it's possible. It's just that it hasn't been. It's not accessible.
It's probably not accessible, and some of this data really goes way far back.
That's what I mean, and a lot of times we'll have those not electronic.
Right.
Yeah,
so we didn't really have the resources to dig that deep in this.
But
I know.
Here you go.
Yeah, it's like socioeconomic part is full of data gaps. More data gaps than data. Real quickly, this is another example I just picked to show something interesting. This shows the line is the population on within the communities on Yukon River within YKL, and the blue bars are the YKL salmon harvest on Yukon River. Just the harvest levels don't seem to correlate very well with the population levels. One of the questions in YKL REA is, how will the population impact subsistence harvest? It's very hard to connect those two, because the data that we have, we can't establish the connection between those two. So it's very hard to project, and even just projection of population is not very reliable, because there are so few numbers, so little data to project reliably. And one big question that the AMT pulled out from all different questions and said, okay, we'll tackle this as one is TEK. What can we do with TEK? What do we have in terms of TEK in YKL? And how best can we use it? What we did was we went and tried to do as comprehensive a literature search as we can, both peer-reviewed and non-peer-reviewed, all kinds of reports from ADF&G, because ADF&G, many agree that that's one of the best sources of TEK here in Alaska. So ADF&G and all different sources, we collected about 57 documents that seemed to meet those qualifications, and we put together a database tagged with each resource is tagged with a CE or a CA or a community or a region, so it's easily searchable, and we can use it for future what can we do with it in the near future is connect it with other sources of data that, those connections can help management decisions and initiate some actions in terms of standardizing the methods to collect TEK because the methods are not standard at the moment. Lots of different methods are used and there is no real quality check that somebody's, it's not a peer review process that's standardized. Some are good, some are hard to assess. And there has to be some more collaboration nationally and internationally so we can have comparisons between what we do here and what we collect here and elsewhere. Takeaway points, data gaps. We started off this effort with trying to put together an index, which was very ambitious, which I realized after getting into it. There's just no way we could do it. One, there is very little data within Whitetail, so we tried to put it together for the entire state, and there was not enough variability to make any meaningful interpretations of that results. So we gave up on that, and we have a whole long list of data gaps from that effort. Human footprint data is scant, as Jamie mentioned earlier. There is not very reliable, comprehensive set of data. For example, none of the hunting lodges are mapped. We can't find a map or data set with hunting lodges. Having lived in that area, I know that there are lots of hunting lodges along Kuskokwim, and none of them are mapped, or at least the data set doesn't exist. Variability is limited, I mentioned that, and mining is an example, subsistence is an example, subsistence survey data is an example from ADF&G where there is data, very useful data, but there is a lot of missing points in that data set that makes it hard to use it. So it may be disappointing, but it's also a good thing to know that there's these gaps that we can pursue.
Walker, this is Cindy up in Fairbanks. I have two questions. I was hoping to hear a little bit more of a take-home message about mining, whether you guys feel like there's new prospects out there or whether that's going to decline. And then my second question is on the traditional ecological knowledge. You said that you guys did find 57 documents. Were you able to extract out of that any information that you then fed into the other models or used to validate other things like, say, an elder somewhere reported that, fish were present and there was no presence point in your aquatic model at that spot? Did you use, were you guys able to use that as feedback?
The first question on mining, we'll talk this afternoon again. As far as prospects, we overlaid the AREF file and picked out active mining sites, Placer and Hard Rock, or just Placer, that fell on active land claim or mining claims. So those are potentially potential Placer mining sites that can be active. As far as Hard Rock goes, we know Donlan Creek is going through their EIS process now, and Pebble is up in the air. So those are the big mines that are in the area, and we identified them on the maps. I hope that answers your question on mining, but we can talk more this afternoon. On TEK, no, we did not try to use any information from those reports. That's one of the decisions we made, or we discussed with AMT, and we decided we won't use any of the TEK data. We'll just try to assess it and put together a database. So we did not try to use any of the data from TEK reports. Thank you.
Okay. Hi, my name is Leah Kinney, and I'm with the Heritage Program, and I'll be presenting on the aquatic coarse filter and the fine filters this morning. And just a reminder, the coarse filters are habitats, and then the fine filters are fish. So I wanted to present this table that we've seen a couple times now, but in the context of the fish species, and I understand that we might look at these data in a little more detail to make sure they're calculated properly. But the take-home message with this table really is that not just one agency or organization is responsible for the management of these conservation elements, but it's multiple agencies.
what were the units on that table?
Those are percentages, sorry. So that,
Okay.
and then the green highlighted, text is just the majority of that conservation element, that is managed by that organization. So I just wanted to highlight that.
So here's an overarching comment on the report. That question has come up on every single table, not every single, probably 60% of the tables haven't indicated what the scale is for the table. That would be a really helpful thing to add.
I took out the table.
So we know what the tables are telling us.
I took out the table heading, but yes,
Okay.
that is very important to know the too, so.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Does this mean upland ownership?
Pardon?
Does this mean upland ownership?
Upland ownership?
Right.
I think it means the land, it's the land base surrounding that.
The land
So we're not trying to get into
Oh,
navigability.
yeah.
Right.
Okay, not really.
It's not management responsibility so much as stewardship responsibility, the percent of their distribution that's following.
Still not a good word.
But it's the land, it's not the water, right?
Well,
Yeah, what's the water that falls within the jurisdictional boundary?
it's, okay, so it's the water body that's surrounded by land
Yeah.
that is owned and or managed by that agency.
Yeah.
Right. Not upline.
Okay, so part of the core analysis for all of the conservation elements was to first identify where in the YKL area, these conservation elements are located, and to develop distribution maps, and this is a product of that effort. So we developed distribution maps for streams, the disconnected lakes, and connected lakes. And I understand that at this map scale, it's hard to discern the individual lake or stream, but when we deliver the data as part of the metadata, those data layers will be available to managers, and you'll be able to zoom into a particular area to get a better sense of where those water bodies are located. So the coarse filter, aquatic coarse filter CEs were all identified up front early on in the REA process as a data gap, and the main reason for that was that we lacked an aquatic habitat classification map for the study area. Our next best data source for just identifying where these water bodies are is the NHD, the National Hydrography Data Set, and that data set has its own sets of limitations. The primary one being that it's outdated by about 50 to 60 years. So I'll talk a little bit more detail about those data gaps here in a couple slides, and then in the memo we have a really detailed discussion on those data gaps and limitations. So in addition to the distribution maps, we developed these conceptual models, and this is an example of the connected and disconnected lakes. And again, for all of the conservation elements, we developed conceptual models to help us qualitatively describe.
Somebody on the phone, please put your phone on mute. Thank you.
So to qualitatively describe some of the potential impacts of these change agents and drivers on the conservation element.
Excuse me, somebody on the phone, would you please put yourself on mute? If you don't have a mute button, it's *86.
Okay.
Maybe they muted us.
Yeah.
So today I'm just going to, well, I should say from the conceptual model, we did an extensive literature review, and from that literature review we pulled out some of the important climate variables that I want to discuss today, which are temperature and permafrost. So the first one is temperature, and for this table here we have the near term and the long term, which again, near term is the 2020s and long term is the 2060s for each of the conservation elements. And Nancy discussed this a little bit in the previous presentation, but really kind of the take-home message here is that in the near term, there's not projected to be much of a change, either warming or cooling, but in the long term, we're projecting to see about greater than 1 degree Celsius temperature increase for all of the aquatic habitats. And again, this is air temperature. Like I said, we don't have water temperature. That's a very big data gap, but And the correlation isn't direct, but we're using it as a proxy for our port filters. And this is important because temperature increases represent kind of the broadest possible stressor that strongly influence other stressors and aquatic ecosystem responses. So increases in temperature could affect things like thermal barriers and fish migrations and movements, depleted oxygen concentrations in the water, and also the potential for increased disease and parasite infections. And also increased temperature can affect increase in permafrost thaw. Too bad.
Hello, can you hear us? Somebody's got their phone on, and we can hear all the paper rattling, and hopefully you're not gonna say anything awful about us that we hear.
Can people on the phone still hear us?
Fairbanks?
Fairbanks can hear you, but we're muted.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you.
Selena,
I'm on mute.
you're on mute?
Yeah, we're gonna narrow this
Okay.
down. I'm wondering
This
if
is Travis.
Stephanie Martin, sometimes she.
Travis in Denver is on mute.
We're having a lot of interference here.
And Angie in Fairbanks is on mute.
Stephanie in Tucson is on mute.
Okay, good. Roz in Anchorage is on mute. Okay, so you're still there. We're not trying to silence you, just you're shuffling paperwork.
Eric. Yeah,
Eric.
You got Eric in that.
Travis.
Okay, all right. Okay, nice and quiet now. Thank you.
So as Nancy indicated, one of the most important potential impacts of permafrost thaw is the potential hydrologic change, and that appears to be potentially important for all of the aquatic habitats in the long term, not so much in the near term. About a 1 to 3% change in continuous permafrost to discontinuous permafrost. But in the long term, out to 2060, we see 12% to up to 1/3 of disconnected habitats potentially experiencing some of this permafrost thaw. This is especially important from a management perspective for disconnected lakes. A recent study throughout Alaska, and some of their study sites are actually in the YKL on refuge lands, looked at the potential for permafrost thaw in relation to disconnected lakes and connected lakes, and what those impacts would be. And what they found was a correlation in the decline in lake area for disconnected lakes, or the loss of habitat, with thawing permafrost. And this could have important repercussions for management and just the use of these resources, because disconnected lakes are an important resource for flood storage and then groundwater regeneration. And they're also essential habitats for fish and other aquatic organisms, and breeding foraging habitat for shorebirds, waterfowl, and other species. Also with permafrost thaw, there's potential for some of these negative impacts, an increase in groundwater discharge, which could change temperature regimes, increase sedimentation, and cause channel disturbance and flooding, potentially scouring of eggs. So those potential effects, though, would likely be more short-lived effects versus the loss or decline of disconnected lake habitat would be a permanent or long-term effect. So those were just two of the examples we wanted to show you from some of the climate change variables, and then we just wanted to highlight, feedback from the ANT team that data gaps were kind of an area that they wanted more input on. So also with some potential suggestions for future research efforts and needs. And again, for the aquatic habitats, the lack of an aquatic habitat classification map is a huge data gap that is affecting effective management of these resources. So any research efforts that are focused on obtaining data to build a habitat mapping framework or a habitat classification map would certainly benefit aquatic management of these resources. And then also the outdated NHD, which Jamie touched on a little bit. There is effort nationwide and in Alaska to update the NHD, and that's already happened for parts of the state, like southeast and south central, and there's efforts for the North Slope too. So hopefully, within the YKL study area, we'll have, an updated NHD here in the next couple of years. I'm not sure what the time frame on that is. So any support of that, from an agency or management, perspective would certainly help in moving towards building a habitat classification map or just more accurately identifying where these water bodies are on the landscape. And then lastly, the climate change predictors specific to aquatic habitats. So water temperature is essential for developing any of these future modeling efforts. And there is some work right now with developing a long-term water temperature monitoring stations throughout the state, and actually standardizing monitoring protocols. And that effort's largely led by Heritage Program, Jamie, and others, and then collaboration with the Western LCC and I think a couple of other agencies. So it's very promising. We don't have the data now, but it's looking promising for, down the road that we might fill in some of these data gaps. So just a summary, in the next decade, we don't anticipate seeing much climate change impacts to aquatic habitats, but within the long term, both temperature and permafrost thaws projected to have an impact on these aquatic habitats. And just in summary, the distribution maps and the conceptual models that we developed can provide land managers with identifying where the habitats are, areas that might be impacted more or less by climate change, and then kind of help to guide or direct some of these future management and research efforts. Yeah.
The second bullet, is that correct, 1 degree centigrade for air temperatures, or is that water temperature?
That's air temperature.
It is air.
Yeah.
This is Cindy up in Fairbanks. I went to a presentation by Marcus Geist about the aquatic online temperature sensor webpage that AKNHP has together, so I went to it, and it looks like there are some places being monitored for water temperature within the RIA. Did that just come online too late for you guys to incorporate, or?
It did, and actually, the AKO's website right now is just documenting who's collected data. It's not necessarily been made available to us. That's hopefully the next step. Right now, we're just documenting that it's there and sort of the metadata associated with it. So we're hoping that's one of the big pushes with the Western Alaska LCC is to bring all this water monitoring data into a common framework so that researchers can start utilizing it. And we're also developing standards for water temperature monitoring, hoping that in 10 years' time or so, maybe we'll have enough data to actually do a reliable relationship between air temperature and water temperature. But it's still very much in its infancy.
Yeah, and some of those monitoring stations that are identified in the YKL actually aren't long-term, and they might just be like a 2-week period or a couple-month period, so they weren't, any data that we could reliably use for any kind of long-term trends. But
yeah, and part of the problem is that the relationship between water temperature and weather, air temperature, climate, it's very complex, because if you think about it, water, it's thawing, it's coming down as meltwater, it changes seasonally. You can get a temporarily warming temperatures can actually make for colder water because you have more snow melt or ice melt in a particular water body. So the climate is warming, so the water gets colder, but the algorithm is enormously complex. So when we say that there's a data gap with regard to water temperature, it certainly doesn't mean that no one's collecting water temperature data. There's a lot of really good work going on in that regard. But as Jamie said, trying to make those linkages in a way that has enough certainty to be useful to managers is a longer-term process.
This is Jen up in Fairbanks. You flashed earlier on one important variable, which is precipitation, and I understand from some of my background reading that precipitation into the future is pretty hard to predict and has the potential to change on pretty small or even ecoregional scales based on what we know from, paleoecological records into the future. And that's something that I think is a pretty important variable for us to at least note some of the major uncertainties about that, both in this, for this aquatic presentation, but just in general, as far as fires and predictions with that too.
Yeah, I'm gonna be talking more about precipitation data, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and I actually, we did look at precipitation and the potential, near-term, long-term impacts to aquatic habitats, and that's in the memo. I just didn't present that today.
Oh yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to highlight the whole the uncertainty about precipitation into the future is a pretty big gap for everybody in the scientific community. So I just don't want to lose track of that throughout this process.
Okay, well,
This is Karen Bedoni out in Galena, and I've done some work on the Kaikuk Refuge delineating lake and some aquatic habitat and wetland habitat classification, and I found the classification systems that are developed for the lower 48, like the NWI, are fairly poor, but there are some Canadian classification systems that seem pretty useful and that could be adapted, that we've kind of adapted for this local area, and I guess I just recommend if we move forward in trying to develop some statewide classification systems that we shouldn't rely on those classifications that are developed for the lower 48 states.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I'll go into the fine filter, or the fish species now, and share some of the take-home messages and products. Okay, I just keep them. Okay, yeah.
I can always roll over after lunch.
Yeah, I'll just focus on the distribution map, because it's kind of cool. This is the first data for the Whitetail, so I really want to show this stuff. And then tomorrow I will go into the methodology in more detail and some of these core analyses. I won't show any of that today, the core analysis intersection, so I'll do that tomorrow. So these two maps are represent examples of the two approaches we took in terms of the methodology for developing the distribution map. So Chinook salmon, the one on your left, the data were all obtained from the AWC, the Annapolis Waters Catalog. It's all presence data and spawning habitat. And we did this for Chinook, chum, and sheefish. And then the Dolly Varden map is actually a model distribution that Becky Schaftel, who's part of the aquatics program at the Heritage Program, developed, and that's really exciting. All these maps are very exciting because it's the first data we have for the distribution of fish in the Whitetail area. But in particular, Dolly Varden and pike, because we didn't have any data prior to this that was in any kind of cohesive format, I guess. They're not covered by the AWC. So that's just, in and of itself, these maps provide great utility for managers, and they're kind of a launching platform, I guess, for doing any further spatial analyses. And then I did want to show this management question and how we answer this management question. So I'll try to go through this relatively briefly, but this question was how, where, and when could essential fish habitat be affected by predicted changes in climate. And essential fish habitat is defined as those waters and substrates necessary for spawning, breeding, feeding, or growth to maturity. And within the whitetail study area, there are two species that fall under the ESH definition, and that's Chinook and chum salmon. So to answer the how part of the question, we did an extensive literature review and developed a conceptual model, and from that process, we pulled out temperature as one of the most important climate variables. And then to answer the where and when part of the question, we took our distribution maps and then overlaid our change in temperature data for the long term to look at where those impacts might be greatest. And this is a product of the spatial analyses. So on the left is the chum salmon and then Chinook salmon on the right. And we'll go into a lot of detail. In fact, I'll just focus really on Chinook salmon and the potential impacts of temperature increases on Chinook salmon. But just to orient you with the figures here, the gradient in color represents the change in temperature from 2010 to 2060. So the southern part of the study area is projected to undergo less of a temperature increase, around 0.9 degrees Celsius, up to the northern part of the study area that's projected to undergo the greatest increase, up to 1.6 degrees Celsius. Again, this is air temperature change. This is important for salmon during July. We chose the month of July because this is when they're spawning and they're more susceptible or vulnerable to the impacts of temperature changes. Both fish species utilize the Yukon River, which flows through the north, as in that region of greater temperature increase. And recent studies over the last couple decades have found a correlation with increased temperature and infection rate of a parasite called ichthyofaunus that causes pre-spawning mortality and a series of other issues for Chinook salmon. And actually have some temperature data for the Yukon River, and over the last decade or so, the temperature has been hovering about 15 degrees Celsius, which is also the threshold for which any temperature increase beyond that, the fish become more susceptible to infection, so the mortality and infection rate goes up anything beyond 15 degrees Celsius. So this is important in terms of management because those temperatures are already hovering at the threshold, so any increase is likely to potentially pose a problem in terms of these increased rates of mortality. And that could have a series of management implications and impacts on subsistence fisheries and commercial fisheries and such. So that's just something we wanted to highlight as an important variable there. And I guess I won't talk much about this landscape condition model, but just in a nutshell, Jamie talked about the landscape condition, and as he said, for most of the study year, everything was pretty highly intact. Anything in blue represents very high landscape status, and anything red or orange is low landscape status. And this is a figure for Chinook salmon habitat, but all of the fish species look similar. They're all classified as high landscape condition currently and out into the future, except for that Kuskokwim road here that we've talked about a little bit. So other than that, the landscape status is fairly high. So data gaps for the fine filters, we talked about this too, the lack of absence data. So certainly having some absence data would help us develop predictive modeling distribution for all of our fish species, updating the NHD, also better quality DEM, and then our climate-linked models and long-term trends and temporal changes in fish populations. So I think we're really pushing it on time, so I'll just end there and if you have any questions, take them at lunch or I don't know.
Yeah, one more. Good question, we'll keep it set up. Yeah, are there any questions for Leah?
I've got a quick question, it's more for Nancy though. So, now, hopefully we'll just take a moment, do you happen to know on the top of your head, what the projected changes for climate will be in the 2030s? Because we're actually doing a plan that's gonna go out to like 2035 and kind of our goal target for like what we think the future will hold. Again, it depends, you know, like the A1B model or the A2 model, it's kind of hard to, but by the 2030, where in some cases you're basically seeing no change from the 2010s to the 2020s, although that's mostly true of like the spring, summer, fall, the winter has some change there. By the 2030s, you are seeing like that trend starting to be more apparent. I don't know if that helps too. I mean, I'm going to talk more about it later, but overall, the trend is much stronger in winter than summer, kind of across the board. It's just that, you know, the expected increment is bigger, so it's easier to see the trend. But yeah, by the 2030s, you should be seeing obvious changes in all seasons. You know, they're not going to be huge. So it depends what the thresholds are for what you're looking at, and that's true for everything. Where like 1 or 2 degrees of change can be enormous. As I was saying with the permafrost, you're seeing this projection of huge change, and it's really only based on, you know, a couple of degrees, you know, for the near term, like, you know, a couple of degrees change in annual temperature. But if those 2 degrees change are from -1 to +1 Celsius, then that's a really huge change. Whereas a change from like +5 to +7 Celsius in a totally different part of the world might be like, yeah. So yeah, we can talk. Yeah, no, that's a good answer.
For those on the phone, this is Keith Boggs, Heritage UAA, and I'm going to talk about the terrestrial course filter. And basically, those are land cover classes or combined land cover classes in one biophysical setting. But before we could do this, it was like the Walker's work, where we didn't have a land cover map for the area. We had one that had poor accuracy, and then we had another one that didn't have enough land cover classes for us to proceed, so we had to put together a land cover map for the region. And this was also funded by, probably more of it was funded by the Fish and Game, to tell you the truth, a large chunk of it. But and Scott and I worked on this together. I'm just going to go over this real briefly, but these are the various maps that we used for the area. Most of it says Ducks Unlimited, that's the blue, but in reality, that's funded by the BLM. These are BLM maps that I think Scott was out on the ground on, and for years and years. And so that was the core of our land cover map.
Keith, this is Cindy. Just to be clear, so did you guys just cookie cutter out of AKNHP's statewide land cover mosaic, or did you do something for just this RIA?
Yes, we clipped it out of the statewide mosaic.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So that was funded partly by this RIA and also by the BLM. Scott, did you have a question? No? Okay. And so we ended up with 6 vegetation classes used for the course filter CEs, and one of them is white spruce or black spruce. Another one's deciduous forest, tall shrub, low shrub, dwarf shrub, herbaceous wetlands. These are pretty basic classes that have been mapped all the way across the state. And then we developed one biophysical setting, which was low elevation floodplains. And then we went ahead and in the document we described what the deciduous forest was and how it functioned, and vegetation change, et cetera. But I'm just going to jump ahead, since we don't have a lot of time here, to the, first of all, the core analysis. And so for each CE, we overlaid the CAs, change agents, associated with each one. And one of them is permafrost, and that's, I've got that at the top because that's probably the most important. And next is fire, and then invasive plants, and then insects and disease. So again, we're just overlaying the change agent layer with our these maps that we have. This one on the left here. And we also looked at temperature, precipitation, and change in length of growing seasons, but we really didn't address that very much because we didn't really know how it was going to affect these different vegetation classes. And again, Nancy already talked about the difficulty in linking these changes and change agents to changes in vegetation over time. And we touched on it a little bit in the document, but so here we have the permafrost impact on vegetation. A lot of numbers out there. I'm going to go to I guess I can just show you this. So for the near term, which is 2020, for deciduous forest, we're just saying just 1% of the deciduous forest CE is going to have either a loss of permafrost or a change in, or a loss of discontinuous permafrost. And for the long term, 20% of it. So by 2060, it's a significant amount of the deciduous forest CE that's going to have that loss. And if you go down, the one with the greatest change in permafrost is part of the floodplains, the large floodplains. And the one with the least amount, I'd have to dig around here anyway, looks like the dwarf shrub. Yeah, the dwarf shrub. And that's, those are basically the high elevation alpine areas. And here I just have it summarized. So for 2025, I've just got 1 to 3% of the permafrost in the YKL is projected to thaw or have a change, which isn't a heck of a lot. But by the 2060s, 8 to 29% of the terms of the vegetation, and I'll get to the limitations of it right now, but, I think the next slide is the limitations, but I think Nancy already presented this, but, one of them is the black spruce. The black spruce woodland and forest component will probably move towards the deciduous and aspen and paper birch component. But it's, it's not a simple thing to do, and I'll go into a little more detail here. That's a picture supposedly of black spruce, of tussock tundra in the area, and you're probably gonna lose all the tussock tundra that's in the area and all the black spruce with tussocks underneath. Some of you are happy about that.
What replaces them?
That's a good question, and, this conversion's been going on for 200 years. The whole area's been, the state's been warming up for 250 years or so, since the end of the Little Ice Age, and so you can theoretically, you can backtrack as to what the vegetation was before. You can predict what it's going to be in the future. And so there are ways to address this, and we're going to try to do this in maybe the North Slope or the Central YKL, and try to provide more of a link between the clown models and the actual vegetation that's on the ground. But there's some steps before we can do that, and one of them is developing a better vegetation map for the region that does things like separate out black spruce and white spruce. I'm jumping ahead.
That's okay, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, that's okay. And then we're supposed to see an increase in the probability of burning, and Nancy mentioned this also, it'll probably move towards more aspen and birch instead of black spruce and white spruce. And we didn't really try to predict it for tall shrub and low shrub, dwarf shrub species, because there's really no literature out there on it right now. We could do expert opinion, which would probably work to some extent, but, and then invasive plants here, invasive species there, yeah. And, but Matt already covered the invasive plants, and I won't dwell on it here at all. I'm just going to forge ahead. I think he already touched on all this, and, the only place we're really expecting any invasive plants would be down on the floodplains at this time. Let's see, I went up. I meant to go down. And Matt also covered insect and disease damage by area. Again, most of the surveys are done on the floodplain, and the major impact is the bark beetle, and it attacks large trees, and so its reduction in its coverage right now might just be because it's already killed off a lot of the large trees that are in the area down in the floodplains. And this is something we never had before, which are the anthropogenically disturbed sites within the REA, and so this is really interesting. But right now, it's only 2% of the entire area. That's and it's just mostly villages, roads, airstrips, hunting, fishing camps, and it's just predicted to go up to 3% to 4% for all of the CEs combined that we looked at. And it's mostly, this increase is due to the Custom Road south of McGrath, the Pebble Mine, and the Donlin Creek Mine.
So did you have hunting and fishing camps?
No.
Okay.
No, I don't. But it is, that's just one of the components of it. But that's not mapped. Here is just an example of the landscape condition model. If you go down the right-hand side, right down through here, for deciduous forest, it looks like, it's all very high. And, but if you go down to the large floodplains right now, that's where most of the disturbance is occurring, down in the floodplains currently. And then, that's 79% there. Follow my cursor. And then in the long term, by 2060, it's just supposed to be increased disturbance, anthropogenic disturbance down in the floodplains. But it's mostly just concentrated on the floodplains. And it has been in the past and will continue in the future. there's just, we provide, these, landscape condition models for each of our conservation elements. I won't, talk on that much, but, I'll just get to the limitations.
Wait, Keith, can you go back to that real quick?
Yeah.
So this was the one that had the most change, and really it's that southern McGrath to Antioch that looks like it's the only area that had the change, down 99% down to 74% or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Then we have the, our limitations and data gaps, and basically we're not able to provide accurate predictions of these conservation elements into the future. And that doesn't mean that it can't be done, but there are certain things that we need better products for, and one of them is a vegetation map that splits out black spruce from white spruce. Right now, it doesn't do that. We weren't able to do that. When you develop these maps, you can't see it on the Landsat imagery that we're using at this time. But there is new imagery out there, and if you develop a new map, you should be able to split out any of these land cover classes that you need in order to make better predictions. And so right now, spatially, we can't even do the predictions. And another one would be such as wetlands. We can't predict what's going to happen with wetlands in the area because we don't have a good soils map for the region. You need a good soils map in order to understand how much ground ice is out there, because when the permafrost is melting, a lot of these areas that are upland right now are going to summer cars, and they're going to turn into ponds and wetlands. And others may have the opposite effect. Well-drained sandy substrates will probably go to forest, and other areas have a thick organic matter layer, and if fire comes through and burns those areas, then that can completely change the ecosystem structure. And so we basically need better baseline data for a vegetation map. And then from that, we can develop this, the second category, which is the vegetation succession map, which is really just biophysical settings or ecological sites. But ecological sites is what the NRCS uses. It's just, the old, it's a soil map. And they use it to predict the response of vegetation to disturbance. And then biophysical settings is similar to ecological sites. It's just, it's what the Forest Service uses for, and actually the BLM uses for predicting succession across the landscape, succession units. And we will be using it for the North Slope right now. I think we've got biophysical settings already mapped up there. We just have it more advanced. But the land cover map is better up there, and also we have other units that have been delineated that we can use for identifying vegetation succession. And then it would be good to have a plant association classification, which is just the finest level of any of these vegetation classifications that we use. And then I have the last thing on there is a thorough review of the succession literature, but that, I'm talking about, we have done that. Nancy did it, and I've dug around some, and in depth for a couple of these vegetation classes. But when I say a thorough review, what I'm thinking of is somehow or other linking our vegetation classes or biophysical settings to these cliomes that Nancy and SNAP has developed in order to make predictions into the future. And it's, gosh, I think I did some of that down Copper River Delta years and years ago. But and so that type of literature review needs to be done. It's just one more step from what we've already done. It's also linking plot data to the client work. Okay,
Okay, good morning, everyone. It's almost lunchtime. I'm going to talk really fast. My name is Tracy Godhart. I am the program zoologist at the Alaska Natural Heritage Program, and I've been the wildlife lead on this REA since its inception. So today I want to talk to you about the terrestrial fine filter conservation element, or more affectionately, the wildlife species. We have a wide cast of characters. There were 8 terrestrial CEs: moose, caribou, muskox, beaver, gray wolf, American peregrine falcon, trumpeter swan, and olive-sided flycatcher. All of these were selected because they represent key wildlife resources in the region. Moose and caribou, particularly because of their subsistence importance. And I just wanted to note that American peregrine falcon, trumpeter swan, and olive-sided flycatcher are all on the BLM-sensitive species list. Okay, so I'm going to take a little bit of a different tactic than some people today. What I wanted to do was just to provide a quick overview of some of the products that we developed today, with hopes that it will tantalize you into coming back tomorrow to see more in depth. So the first thing that we did for all the fine filter, or for the wildlife species, was to develop distribution maps, and we did these at various levels of complexity. The first map, and I can use the pointer, which is great. This is the distribution map for mooses in the region. This was taken from the Alaska Gap Analysis models, and it was just cookie cutter to the YKL REA boundary. So this is the overall distribution of moose within the REA during summer season. You can see that they're widely distributed, but we know that moose also concentrate during certain times of the year, during foraging, or during the rut, or during winter, or during calving. So we also produce more specific distribution maps. And this is an example of moose during the winter season where they're concentrated in moose floodplains. So a different level, different scale of mapping. For caribou, we simply mapped the ranges of the 8 different herds which occur in the REA during different seasons. And this was a range map which was provided to us by ADF&G, but we updated it based on satellite collar data for some of the herds and based on expert opinion largely. For caribou, we also mapped the distribution of lichen. Caribou rely heavily on lichen during the wintertime, and so we were able to produce a lichen distribution map for them. This is to answer one of the management questions. And then this is just another example of a distribution map for gray wolf. Again, this came from the GAP models, and you can see gray wolf occur pretty much everywhere within the REA, except in areas of ice and snow, these higher areas. Oops, for those of you, if anybody's still online. Over here, north of Lake Clark. But we also know that wolves are tied very closely to the distribution of their prey, specifically caribou and moose, and so we overlaid then the distribution map for moose during all the seasons when they're concentrated and the distribution map for caribou to produce this composite map for wolf, where you might have more likelihood of encountering them during specific seasons based on the distribution of their prey. Okay, so those are just some examples of the distribution maps that we created. Again, this is a table real similar to the one that Leah showed you, where we took those distribution maps and we overlaid them with the managed areas map to identify the percentage of that species distribution which fell under the jurisdiction of each manager. So in the left-hand column, you've got the landowners, and across the top, you've got the terrestrial fine filter CEs. Again, green boxes indicate that manager had the highest percentage of that distribution falling within their jurisdiction. So for muskox, 72% of their overall distribution falls under BLM lands. No surprise, muskox occur in the northern part of the REA exclusively. What was interesting to me, and I had never just really thought about it, was the high percentage of all these species distributions which are located in state lands. And it wasn't until we started putting all these products together that I was like, the state really plays a huge role in this. And so if we are going to be developing management plans for any of these species across the REA, comprehensive or conservation plans, a number of players need to be at the table, and it's very important that we have this statewide state representation here.
Now, it would be helpful on all of these tables that break out land ownership and percentages to have a column on there with the percentage of that land ownership and the total REA boundary, because and it's obvious with DNR lands being the majority of lands there, it makes sense they're going to have the majority of evenly distributed resources.
Yeah, and yeah, we do apologize. I think that's probably the second or third time we've heard that comment and wholeheartedly agree. So, you know, it can be a little bit misleading without those numbers there. Okay, so very quickly, because I have like 2 minutes, I just wanted to provide you a couple examples of what happens, or the CE by CA interactions or overlap, the core analysis that we did. And I have 2 examples, one from climate and one for development. So I'm going to talk about growing season lengths. And I think really what I want you to focus on are the bullets at the bottom. But, okay, again, on the left-hand column, you've got the individual CEs. Across the top of the table, you've got the change in length of growing season from current. So less than 0 days means decrease in growing season, 0 to 6 days, almost a week, 7 to 14 days, and then greater than 14 days. And what we see for the near term, which is out to 2025, is that growing season is really not expected to see too much change in the long term for this species. We see some decreases and some increases, but for the long term, growing season is expected to increase by a week for every habitat within the distribution of the CEs in the REA. What are the implications of changes in growing season? Some of the anticipated changes are changes in timing of emergence and abundance of biting insects, forest pests, parasites, and disease vectors, changes in timing of emergence of insect prey and forage quality and quantity, advanced onset of green-up, and changes in breeding season duration. And these affect not just a single CE, but multiple CEs. And then these CEs were selected because they represent or they can be used as surrogates for larger groups. For example, trumpeter swans. Implications for trumpeter swans probably largely apply to other waterfowl species that utilize similar habitat types. So I wanted to drill down real quickly into the changes in breeding season duration. And this is just an example that Nancy and myself and Jessica Weimer did for the trumpeter swan. Excuse me. Literature studies have shown that trumpeter swans require a minimum of 140 ice-free days to breed, and successfully fledge their young. And the majority of the YKL meets this minimum threshold. So the distribution map on the upper left-hand quadrant with the mustard color is the current distribution of trumpeter swans in the REA, and you can see that they occur mostly in the north and the eastern part of the REA. They do not occur in the southern half of the REA. And on the right-hand upper map is our current conditions, where the color coding goes from the darker green indicates greater than 180 days within the growing season, and that growing season length gets shorter as you go northward. But overall, conditions within the REA meet this minimum threshold of over 140 days. However, conditions are expected to get much warmer. Growing season is supposed to get longer throughout the REA, and what you see is a lengthening of growing season, especially throughout the southern part of REA, but also up into the northern part of the REA, where we do have trumpeter swans occurring. So one of the take-home messages here is that changes in growing season length could potentially benefit swans by promoting fledgling success or fledging success. And I say swans loosely because the current range of trumpeter swans is right about here, but the current range of tundra swans really hugs the southern border of the REA, and so it may improve conditions for tundra swans, or it may improve conditions for trumpeter swans, and you may see them moving south. So we don't know, but just be on the lookout. It's probably overall could improve conditions for swans and maybe waterfowl in general. Karen?
So, I mean, looking at these maps, it seems like trumpeter swan habitat is not correlated very well to growing season at all. So what would make us think that there might actually end up being, it seems, I mean.
Well, I think that it right where trumpeter swans occur right now, you do have these moderate conditions where, we have greater than 140, or growing season is currently greater than 140 days.
Sure.
So we don't maybe see an expansion in their range at all, but maybe they will have a little bit more time to raise their young, to sit on their nests, and so maybe they will be a little bit more productive within this.
Maybe, or maybe what they're correlated with is this continuous lakes.
So that's the next slide that I don't have time to say, so that's why I say stay tuned.
And when they melt, and when permafrost goes and those lakes go, we're going to lose trumpeter swans.
But there is an interesting point here that I think will come up in some Tracy's work, is that often
rarely do we have density. But
Yeah.
sometimes we're lucky enough for the literature to talk to us about density, so that can make a huge difference. Having a species be present is really different from having it at high density or lower, so, yeah.
Right, and these responses aren't, linear or linked to one single variable. They're all integrated. That's why we've developed these conceptual models to see what these interactions would be. And so today, because I had, minus 2 minutes to talk to you, you're only going to see this slide, but we did overlay with, permafrost, and we talked about the two interconnected, or the relationship between those two. So I'm going to skip over temperature and the beaver story because Jamie showed you this slide already, and so we'll delve into that a little bit more. And then landscape condition, all of you have seen this, but the same story applies for wildlife species. The majority of habitat for wildlife species is currently classified as high landscape condition, and future projections suggest that these conditions will continue, the trend will continue at very high condition, except along that road, which could increase hunter access, specifically for caribou and moose and maybe swans, waterfowl, birds. So we had 10 management questions, and now I'm going to answer all of them. All I wanted to say about this is that all of these questions were answered under a spatial framework. So we do have GIS data to support this analysis and GIS outcomes, which I think are one of the most important and valuable aspects of this whole REA is that we are producing these spatial data layers, which then can have a future beyond the REA. There's only one question, what are the current types and potential impacts of disease in ungulate populations that we were not able to answer spatially, and this was answered through a literature review. Okay, so take-home messages. The spatial data layers, the species distribution, and the habitat models produced for this analysis provide a baseline. That's our take-home message that until now are missing from this REA, and so this includes the results of the core analysis and the management questions. As I already alluded to, any comprehensive management plan regarding any of the CEs across the REA will have to be a multi-agency undertaking. The CE by CA analysis provides some specific examples of how this information can be used to anticipate shifting stressors, but these are only a few examples of how the data can be used. And then lastly, this assessment combines both quantitative and qualitative methods to inform objective conclusions. If any of you have opened up that technical supplement, you'll see that it exceeds 800 pages. There's a lot of literature review in there, which I think is incredibly invaluable information. I ask you not to gloss over it while you're, just to go directly to the maps. I think that we did our homework, and we're really sad if that information was not used. So data gaps, Nancy's already hit on the top and the bottom one. We lacked a suitable snow depth layer, which precluded examination of the relationships of deep snow and moose and caribou and muskox. And the literature didn't provide precise information regarding threshold values so that we could link the species to the various CAs. The middle one we have tackled. There was a lack of a data sharing agreement with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, which precluded access to some spatial data sets which we really needed, particularly for muskox and caribou. For the North Slope REA, we were able to forge a data sharing agreement with ADF&G, so we're making strides forward in that area. Okay, fast enough.
Tracy, this is Cindy up in Fairbanks, and it might be a question for Keith too. So in Keith's presentation, he said that the only CE they were able to create a map for with much confidence was floodplains, and then as you were going through your slides, it looked like there was a lichen map for caribou and maybe something else for some of the other species.
Yeah, Keith, I think I may have misspoken. I meant an accurate map that we could project forward, even though we didn't spatially do that. But,
can you hear him?
Not a baseline.
So is there a lichen map that you guys have some confidence in?
We produced a lichen map, a willow map, and then a map for the forage utilized by muskox, which I'll present on tomorrow. But so yes.
But what you guys are doing, what we've got in the current map, we can't really predict succession very effectively because we don't have the underlying data layers that would allow us to model that forward.
Right.
Yeah.
Did you understand that? Yep. Okay. Yeah, they they were confused about the prediction versus the current distribution.
Yeah.
There's a long list of.
I still don't understand it. I think what I'm hearing is you couldn't project forward in a lot of the vegetation classes, but we were projecting habitat forward?
No, we're not projecting habitat forward either. All we're doing is projecting the effects of the stressors on habitat forward, on current habitat. Does that make sense?
I think so. Maybe this afternoon it'll be clearer.
We need lunch.
Maybe tomorrow. This afternoon, change agents,
Well,
but tomorrow.
I think you guys can do better than that. It's the difference between being able to predict, how many trumpeter swans there will be versus how many, the days in which to have, good habitat so that your fledglings have time to mature. That's the information that they're pretty well able to predict, but not how many trumpeter swans will be.
So I think it's even something different. I think what we're saying is that we only have current distribution maps for all of our species and habitats. But what the next step forward was to take kind of our model distributions of our temperature and precip and all of our change agents and overlay that with where we know current habitats are. So we weren't able to do the next step where you'd take you'd model current habitats and try to predict where they'd occur in the future.
We didn't forecast habitat or species distributions into the future, such as bioclimatic envelope models too, which they did for the SNK REA, which met with much criticism, which is largely why we balked at it here, besides the.
Well, there just wasn't a good theoretical basis for doing bioclimatic envelope models, especially not for the coarse filters that ended up getting chosen. So I think that's the big distinction is that, so the only time we did specific CE-CA overlaps, like with the trumpeter swan or the beaver examples, is when we had some documented mechanistic link that we could examine. Those don't exist for coarse filter habitats because it's an assemblage of things. So there's no way you could say, yes, temperature is going to equally impact all dwarf shrub ecosystems in this way, and so we were not able to infer any kind of specific changes that way. Where we were able to with a couple of fine filter species where there's these nice documented thresholds in the literature that suggested temperature is important for permafrost or whatever is important for this specific species. So that's really the distinction. So we are in the North Slope hoping to develop coarse filters that can be linked specifically to mechanistic functions or mechanistic links to climate and the other change agents. That's something we were not able to do here because, like Keith said, we lack a good map and good biophysical settings. So.
Not to cause confusion, but when I talk about climate, I will be talking a bit about trying to look at climate as a sort of heuristic of multiple variables and seeing areas where it's changing across all months and across temperature and precipitation, and that's what we're calling climes or climate envelopes. But as Jamie said, those don't match up. They don't create like a complete climate envelope model. They do provide some useful information, and I'll be talking about that a bit more after our lunch break. But we found that for a single species, certainly it's much more valuable to dig really deeply into the literature and find where there are thresholds that match with particular variables for which we have useful data.
But they're super few and far between.
Yeah, so it's one of the key data gaps, I think, for all climate change research is just understanding how species are going to respond and what variables are most important and how to monitor those.